young people are not just the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today, and really thinking about how do we unleash that leadership. So we talked a lot in this conversation about networks, skills, and platforms, and I think there's some actionable insights that we've shared around what folks can do.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce MacDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our supporting partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. In our sector, women represent 77% of the workforce, and young people make up 32%. Today, on the International Day of the Girl, we're handing the mic to two leaders who are actively shaping the future of Canada's nonprofit sector. We're thrilled to be joined by Anjum Sultana, Director of Policy Advocacy, Partnerships, and Youth Leadership at Plan International Canada. Anjum brings over 15 years of experience as a practitioner focused on ensuring access to opportunity for youth from diverse backgrounds. We're also excited to welcome Emma Asiedu-Akrofi, CEO of FORA Network for Change. Emma leads an organization dedicated to equipping young women, girls, and gender-diverse youth with the tools and opportunities they need to drive global change. Sector leaders like Anjum and Emma are not just asking for a seat at the table for younger generations, they're reimagining it entirely. We'll hear what organizations can learn from youth leadership, what structural changes are needed to equitably share power, and how funders and sector leaders can meaningfully support the next generation of changemakers, not just in the future, but starting now. So welcome, Anjum and Emma. Delighted that you could join us here today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So, Anjum, we're going to start with you. As I mentioned, you've been working in this sector for over 15 years. What inspired you to get involved in this work, and what continues to motivate you in your work and leadership today?
Thank you. And I feel so fortunate that my career has brought me to the nonprofit sector, and it's truly taken me from the micro to the macro. So a bit of background on me. I first started off my career in academia as a neuroscientist, then got exposed to the research literature on the social determinants of health. So how issues like housing, race, age, gender, employment, labor conditions, and more sometimes plays a bigger role in influencing your overall health and well-being. And it's more than just what happens inside our bodies from a biomedical perspective or our access to healthcare services later on. It's truly the social determinants of health that provides us the opportunity to mitigate poor health outcomes, to promote physical health and well-being and mental health and well-being, and what gives us the connections and social capital to live a happy and healthy life. I've seen what a difference it's made in the communities I've been able to work alongside. And what's been special is the charitable and nonprofit sector is at the front lines of impacting those very social determinants of health. And so after leaving the world of academia and think tanks, I brought that same evidence-based policy approach to my work, policy advocacy and strategic communications, and I haven't looked back since. And where I see our opportunity to make the greatest impacts on society is investing in children and young people, especially those from equity-deserving communities. And what I've seen is that it's at our greatest peril that we underestimate young people, that we overlook them. And part of my journey has been how do we continue to look and support young people as the assets and strengths to bring to society.
It's always so interesting. One of the great things about doing this podcast is you meet so many different people, and hearing that link between academia, science, and social determinants of health. It's always fascinating that everybody comes into this work from such a different starting point. And Emma, we're going to kind of explore a similar thing. As CEO of FORA, you're leading an organization that focuses on amplifying the voices of young women and gender diverse youth. What drew you to this role, and how has your personal journey shaped the way you lead?
Yes, thank you. I must say that every time I hear Anjum speak, I'm always so inspired if I see her LinkedIn features or any event that she's at. I'm very inspired by the work you're doing, Anjum, so congratulations on that. In terms of what drew me to this role, it was a windy road, which I will spare you the details of, but it really was informed by my upbringing. I'm first generation Canadian of being of Ghanaian descent. I always say I love my parents and I love the foundation they provided for us. But even at a young age, I saw the inequalities that were rooted in my household, being the youngest girl of two children, the oldest being a boy, and just seeing like the dynamics in terms of who had to be in the kitchen, who was told that they have to learn to cook and clean, whereas who was like let go to be free. Although education was reinforced with both of us, there were still these minor injustices that in terms of when I was a young person, I just would call them, it's not fair, right? I didn't have the language to see its inequalities or injustice, but it wasn't fair. And so as I graduated and I went to university and I decided I wanted to be a lawyer and I wanted to advocate for those who are from underrepresented communities, I didn't end up being a lawyer, but I really wanted to do some values-driven work. And I wanted to be in an organization that aligned with who I was and what I identified as a Black Canadian woman. And it ended up being that I went to the YMCA of Greater Toronto, which was very, very much aligned with my values. And through that, I was really introduced to work where we were advocating for marginalized communities from a broad perspective. If anyone knows the YMCA, I know, Anjum, you're very familiar with the YMCA of Greater Toronto. And then from there, I was able to take this major leap into the gender equity space when I ventured into becoming the executive director of the Jean Augustine Center for Young Women's Empowerment. And I was there for over 7 years. And during that time is really when I honed my skills and my education on what gender equity and gender equality really means. At that organization, we really worked at the local level to empower young women and girls between the ages of 7 to 17 by providing mentorship and after-school programs and just networks and communities of support to open their eyes to see what they could be when they were given the tools, resources, and accesses to achieve their full potential. And through that, I loved the work. It really spoke to my heart being at that organization. But when it was time for me to leave, I knew I wanted to, I don't want to say do more because what I was doing was great, but I wanted to do something different. And that FORA afforded me was the opportunity to do that. I was able to come into FORA, which is an organization, it's a Canadian charity that works nationally and globally to advocate for a little bit older demographics. So we work with young women and gender marginalized youth between the ages of 18 to 29. And again, we do this within the context of Canada and globally. And we advocate for them to access leadership spaces to advance in their career, to advance their social impact initiatives. We do this by providing training, mentorship, a bit of funding depending on the program, and then experiential learning opportunities. For example, we place young directors on boards across Canada, which is a phenomenal program through our Rise on Boards program. And so this really allowed me to step into a different form of role in leadership, where I was able to see the work done not only at the individual level, but also at the systems level, which is what I wanted to get into. I wanted to understand how could we really influence policy and systems change at that level. And that's what we do at FORA Network for Change. And so in terms of what this meant for how it shaped my journey to lead, every milestone informed what kind of leader I wanted to be. Anytime I interacted with people, be it as a direct report or having people report out to me, I would say, what kind of leader do I want? And what kind of leader do other people want? It really informed by those who would listen, who would understand, who would provide me access and a seat at the table even when I wasn't ready for it, and would provide the mentorship and the opportunities to train and learn until I felt I was confident to step into this role. So it's really informed who I am as a leader by seeing others do it so well before me.
It's just wonderful to hear. It's amazing, too, how many people have connections to the YMYW movement, especially earlier in their careers. I'm one of those who got a chance to have my first full-time job at a university through a YMCA. So just amazing. And your comment and the program that FORA offers around placing young women onto boards. I mean, I think this is where we're going to spend some time, is really talking about how youth and young people can really engage, and in this case, young women can really engage in offering leadership. And I thought it was interesting, your comment around too, but even when you weren't ready, and how these can also be learning experiences, not just looking for board directors that bring particular skill sets or qualities, but actually viewing boards as a place for learning and growing. So Angel, I'm going to come to you for the next question. You know, many structures in the sector were designed without young people in mind. One example is traditional board governance, where expectations around years of professional experience, financial contributions, or established networks can make it difficult for young people to participate in meaningful ways. These kinds of requirements often exclude the very voices that organizations say they want to include. So when you think about leadership in the nonprofit sector today, what feels outdated or limiting to you? And what structures or norms do you think need to be reimagined?
This is such an excellent question and at the heart of what we hope to do at Plan International Canada and our peers. And I'll say we learn a lot from our peers at FORA Network for Change. Just to attest to the Rise on Boards program, I had the opportunity a number of years ago to be a coach. And through that, I had the opportunity to be a mentor, to provide a sounding board, to provide a safe space to share. Because often young people, especially folks from different backgrounds, are sometimes the first, the only, the few, and it can be very isolating. So having that source of support is important. And I would say as a sector, first of all, we need to invest in more of these initiatives and to look at less from a deficit perspective, like what are young people missing that we can fill the gap with, but also thinking about it from a strengths-based perspective. What are the assets young people bring to an organization? What valuable perspectives do they have? And how can we, by addressing barriers, unlock that potential, unlock that knowledge base, and bring those insights and innovations into our organization? So one of the things I've seen as a sector adopting more, and not just the nonprofit and charitable sector, but I've seen this in the private sector and public sector, is having established youth advisory councils. So we can go beyond tokenistic engagement with young people, but that longer term engagement, because through that longer term engagement, you can actually build capacity, but also just greater awareness of the issues your organization is challenged with and how young people can be part of the solution. I'll also say it's really important to break down barriers. So you mentioned a few of the barriers, and one of the barriers we often see is cost. Right now, the cost of living is increasing. And so some of the different professional development opportunities you would want to invest in early on becomes a no-go zone because you don't have the financial resources to pay for your basic needs. And so for us at Plan International Canada, we really ensure that cost is never a barrier. So if a young person is selected for our programs, we ensure that we can cover financial costs of programming, travel, of accommodations. Sometimes it's costs for having business professional wear. That's sometimes a barrier, not feeling like you're looking the part. So those are some of the places that we look at. And I'll say, and big thank you to FORA and other organizations, we at Plan International Canada have a young person on our board of directors. It is the second person that we've had, and it's something that we'll continue to practice. And we've also seen this at our global headquarters as well. So we're making a conscientious effort to invest in generational diversity in our leadership spaces. And for us, it's not only a gift that unlocks new ways of thinking, but it's also a risk mitigation strategy, because when you look at the biggest challenges of our time, young people are experiencing it first and most. So they need to have a seat at the table in terms of how do we respond as a society.
These are some great thoughts. I'm going to add a question in here on the fly a little bit. And Emma, I'm going to direct this to you. And then Anjum, I'm going to come back to you on this one. And it relates to the comment you made about youth advisory councils. I mean, I've been around for a long time, and I've seen lots of organizations try the youth advisory council model. One of the disconnects that I've observed over the years is that sometimes youth advisory councils create ideas, thoughts, and recommendations that the organization becomes uncomfortable with because they're maybe advocating for significant change. And so I'm going to circle back on this after this next question, just to see what advice or counsel you have for organizations that create intentional structures for young people, but then how do they activate or actually translate that listening or recommendations into work so it doesn't feel just like an exercise? So we'll come back to that in a second. And I think it does feed into this question. And Emma, like we've talked about the phrase youth engagement, and it gets used a lot. So from your experience, what does meaningful engagement actually look like?
Yes, that's a great question. So meaningful engagement, I think the first step is bringing them to the table, but that is the very first step in the bare minimum. But as they are at the table, are they really having influence, power, and decision-making opportunities is first and foremost. And if they're not having that, then what does it look like for that to happen? What you would usually be needed, or what I would recommend be needed, is really investing in their leadership. Like if we're bringing them to the table and they're not prepared, we want them there, we want them to learn, but we also need to invest in their learning and their leadership development, right? So does that mean providing mentorship? For example, at FORA Network for Change, we provide a mentor who sits on the board with them, as well as a coach who is external to the board, who can go along the journey with them and troubleshoot when they have challenges while they're sitting on board. It's very important to build that network of support around them, as well as like centering their voices in the work that we're doing, right? What is the saying? Nothing about us without us. So how do we really truly center the voices of the young people who want to be engaged and are engaging in this work, so that they are speaking first and we are listening, and then we're receiving that information, and then collectively we're making decisions together to advance whatever initiative or mission that we are working towards. And then it's also that sharing of power. I truly, truly love this intergenerational model of having, the young youth, as well as those baby boomers and those who are nearing retirement, coming together collectively to share their learnings and understandings and their perspective of the world. And so how do we share this power intentionally? How do we recognize when the system, for example, within a board of directors, who's sitting on your executive committee? Do the young people really have an opportunity to have their voices heard? How can we get them to sit in a position of a vice chair or a secretary or a treasurer, or even the chair, and creating opportunities for this without having so many barriers to access? I would say those are the most important things in terms of youth engagement, in terms of my perspective.
Yeah. So Emma, just coming back to this question on the Youth Advisory Council model, because I think it's probably one of the most common that we've seen over the years. Where have you seen organizations have success in ensuring that both youth are engaged meaningfully, but that maybe some of the thoughts and recommendations are acted upon, as opposed to it feeling more like an exercise? Do you have any sort of thoughts or suggestions for folks out there in terms of how to advance that?
I wish I could say I did, to be honest. I will be fully transparent and fair, where, yes, we have had youth advisory councils, and not only within FORA, but in other organizations. The challenge that I've had, to the point that you've made, Bruce, is, do they feel that their voices are really heard and incorporated into the final decision-making process? And often the answer is no. So we never want to make it seem like it's a performative act. Okay, you know what? To pacify you, we're going to put you on a youth advisory council, and you can talk about ideas, but nothing really comes to fruition. So that's why things like the Rise on Boards program, which truly puts young people in a voting position on a board of directors and really gives them that voice in governance, is important. So again, I wish I could give you a success story in terms of youth advisory, but at the moment, I truly don't have it. What I will say, though, in terms of the decision-making, what I will say is that our steering committees, as we call them, which are youth advisory councils, have brought so many ideas and recommendations at the operational level in terms of shaping our programs, shaping the conversation, shaping the alumni engagement, which does inform our organization, but it still hasn't reached the level of our governance yet. And that's where I'd love to see it go.
That's super helpful, though, because if you think about organizations and an authentic desire to engage young people, maybe even starting with the right mandate so that there is a viable operation in place, and then it can evolve into the governance level over time, might be a way to think about it. So, Angel, I'm going to come to you with the next question. I do invite you to sort of address this question of youth advisory councils in your response, if you feel comfortable, because the next question is about kind of influence and power. And while young people are often celebrated in principle, the path to real influence can be full of obstacles. So this idea of organizations still relying on rigid hierarchies, formal titles, decision-making processes that they favor seniority over fresh perspectives. And even when young people are invited into the room, they may not be given the power or the trust to make a meaningful contribution. So from your experience, what are some of the biggest barriers young people face when trying to lead or influence change in these kind of environments? And what do you think actually needs to shift?
Yeah, such a great question. And I'm appreciating the discussion around like how do we ensure our values and our intention connect back to impact? Like how do we make that fully realized? So just going back to the question about youth advisory councils, one of the things we've seen, and this goes back to the conversation around decision making and ensuring that the mandate, that the topics that young people are deliberating about are of priority to the organization and there's a pathway to influence, is we link it back to the strategy. Because the strategy is often what the board of directors is holding the organization accountable to, the management team. And so when we're, putting forward opportunities to engage, we link it back to the strategic plan. So it's not something that's happening over there. It's linked to the very mission and mandate of the organization. So that would be something I would encourage organizations that are looking to embed that type of advisory council structure. Is it linked to your strategic plan? Is it something that is important for the organization at the highest levels and there's accountability mechanisms? So it's not something that happens in isolation, but is deeply linked to what the organization is focusing on for the next number of years. You raised a number of barriers, right? It comes down to trust. It comes down to people believing whether or not young people have the skill set to engage. And I think part of it is, as you would do with any board member, any type of individual, we all should have all the tools in our toolbox to fully participate and fully be set up for success. So one of the things I'll say is not only looking at young people engaging, and generational diversity is a nice to have, but essential for our operating moving forward. So just to give an example of the statistics, millennials and Gen Z make up over 40% of the working age population in Canada, and Gen Z is set to become the largest generation in the next few decades. So we do ourselves a disservice as a country, as a sector, if we don't future-proof and strategize. And I think we've seen that in the pandemic, for example. We've seen this in our current economic challenge as a country. We need to be thinking ahead, and having young people at the table allows us to do that in a different way than if they weren't part of the table. And one of the things we've seen at Plan International Canada, for example, is, young people say some of the greatest challenges they face is not having the skills, platforms, and networks to drive the change we see. So part of what we do in partnership with our ecosystem of partners is building that confidence, is building that sense of community. So young people don't feel isolated when they're trying to create change. They learn how to create buy-in. They learn how to build relationships across generations, across different parts of the organization. We also do a lot around ensuring that they have the resources to spark action. So for example, in the advisory council, is there a budget? Is there human resources attached to it? Is this something where they're actually given the platform to really drive action? We've seen this, for example, in our flagship program, Girls Belong Here. Next year will be its 10-year anniversary. And what we've done is we paired young people with senior leaders across different sectors, the private sector, nonprofit, public sector. And we've seen these engagements translate into real-world impact in changing brand and marketing strategy, in shifting an organization's strategic planning processes. We've seen this change the way they search for talent. I know a big conversation in the sector is how many years of employment or experience do people actually need? How do we actually make that more accessible? How do we remove educational qualifications if it's not absolutely necessary? We've seen with the work we do with young people, companies have changed how they do recruitment practices after engaging with young people. And also finally, around ensuring products and services best meet the needs of intended audiences and clients. So Emma spoke about this, nothing about us without us. So we've seen these Gen Z focus groups actually really change an organization's approach to different issues. So I'll leave it there. But in terms of, I think the heart of the matter is decision-making and thinking about what is the enabling environment for decision-making. And it comes down to financial resources, human resources, and ensuring young people are set up for success.
Yeah, thank you. And some great real-world examples of progress that's being made. And you moved us beautifully into this next question around decision-making. And I'm going to broaden it a little bit in terms of not just decision-making, but learning, because it strikes me that one of the grand things about inviting younger voices into conversations is that there may be bigger areas of disagreement. They may actually challenge, and I've seen this, really challenge some of the long-held precepts of organizations. I think the tendency for many organizations is to create consensus or unanimity, whereas there's a wonderful opportunity here to actually lean in and explore why those differences are in place. So as we think about nonprofits and how they make decisions and or learn, If you were going to change, say, one thing about how organizations go through these processes, what would it be and why?
I would change who is at the table. And this is not for every organization. Some organizations are really doing the due diligence and doing the work to ensure that they have equitable representation at their governance table level and senior management as well. But there are still significant gaps in certain organizations in terms of who is making decisions and who for those within their community. And so I think it's important to really have a reflective conversation on, does your leadership reflect the community that it's serving? And if it doesn't, what needs to be done about that? So one of the things that I love about Senator Ratna Amidvar is that she has instituted Bill S-279, which is a step in the right direction. It would really enforce that Canadian Cherries report on demographics and the diversity of their board representation. And that is just one step in the direction of terms of seeing the data. Data is everything, right? Seeing the data of who is sitting on boards. And then from there, it's up to the organization and the sector to take that data and actually do something constructive with it. How can we create recruitment practices that ensure that those who have been barred from these positions of leadership have access to it? What does it look like for someone to truly be qualified to sit on a board? Are we only evaluating them based on their academic or their professional experience? Are we really truly valuing the lived experience that they're bringing to the table? And then what is our understanding of what it looks like as an organization for this to become the norm? For example, at FORA, one of the things that we are super, super proud of is on our own board, we ensure that we have representation from our participants and alumni. So once they've come through the programs, they then have the opportunity to sit on our board. So currently we have 3 alumni who are sitting on our boards who represent the community that we're serving. They bring the voices and the values of this powerful Gen Z generation who are not afraid to share what they think and are not afraid to push for change. And they bring this new perspective, this innovation that is so important. So how does an organization create the recruitment pipelines and the training and the opportunities so those that are sitting at the table truly represent their community?
I think these are some great questions for organizations to be asking themselves. So Anjum, this is probably the shortest question I'll ask today. How can funders better support youth-led work?
I think first and foremost, fund the work and be flexible. This current cohort of young people is facing a poly crisis, not only here in Canada, but globally, and it's only escalating. For example, Gen Z right now in Canada, I believe it's the worst youth unemployment rate in decades since after the aftermath of the 2008 recession, for example. So that is the type of environment that they're operating in and experiencing. And they're often the canary in the coal mine. So what impacts young people, it creates a bit of a ripple effect throughout society. So I would say invest in programming that supports young people, but then look at how you can scale the impact, whether it's through research, public policy, systems change work. Often that type of work that organizations do in that realm is underfunded. So I would say that's an area that funders can invest in. And I would also say when you're looking at your investments or looking at your funding approaches, looking at, how you can fund issues related to youth employment. Can that be built into the programs and grants? Because right now we are facing the biggest youth unemployment crisis in the country. Anytime you lose your job, it's devastating, but when you lose your job earlier on in your career, it has a scarring effect for decades to come. So this is something we as a country need to look at, not just for the here and now, but what does this mean for the future of Canada? We're having these conversations about productivity. What does it mean if young people are not supported during this very challenging time? I'll say we need to engage more in trust-based philanthropy. So I've seen this experience, and I'm sure Emma as well. When you're working with young people, you have your kind of articulated program plan, but you also need to be responsive to what young people bring to the table. And their lives are more complex than ever. So I think that flexibility in funding should also be of consideration. I think about the wonderful work of funders like the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and others. They've been doing some really interesting work around supporting racialized communities and other underrepresented communities in influencing change at a municipal level, working in cities across the country. So I think that type of public policy, government relations, capacity building of young people is important. I would also say invest in research that also directly engages in young people as knowledge holders, not just as passive recipients of programs. So, for example, Plan International Canada every year, we publish a report called the State of the World's Girls Report. It's our flagship research report, and it's one of the few out there that really tracks what is changing for girls globally. So this year, for example, our focus is on early forced and child marriage. It's an issue here in Canada and globally. There's 12 million girls who, before their 18th birthday, get married off, and that's a marriage every 3 seconds. So these are some of the issues that we're seeing in Canada and globally, and I think having research that really gives young people, especially girls and young women, the opportunity to share their perspective so they can be part of the change is important. So folks, if they're interested in learning more about that, I encourage them to check out plancanada.ca, Day of the Girl. And so those are some of the recommendations I have for funders. They're doing great work already. Part of it is just amplifying and some of the things I mentioned.
So, Anjum, these are some great thoughts around the importance of funding this work. And it's interesting the times that we're living in. From the time this podcast airs in just over a month, we will see a new federal budget. We've got an expenditure review taking place through the federal government right now that is looking at different departments and the programs and services they offer. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the importance of ensuring that this work has the necessary resources in order for it to continue and thrive.
Yes, definitely. We are in some scary times for individuals and also as a sector within the gender equity space. It was recently announced that there's a potential cut to women and gender equality up to 80% in terms of funding. And so for that significant cut is going to impact a significant amount of organizations, including FORA Network for Change, as we have to navigate what it will look like not to have the funding or potentially not to have the funding from government as we've had in the past, which for many of us is the foundation of and that enables us to do the work that we're doing at the scale that we're doing it. So it would have a significant impact on the ability for organizations to plan, to advocate for, to work with these young people. And so with having this funding, which is so important, it allows us to think about sustainability. What does our organization not only look like for this year, but over the long term, for the 3, 5, and 10 years and beyond? And then really to plan so that we're not doing it on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis, which also impacts the workforce, which significantly is made up of women and gender marginalized individuals. So the precarious employment, the job insecurity, the economic instabilities that we're facing is a significant impact to our communities. So without this funding, it would cause significant impact on organizations and the sector in general. We would lose a lot of great organizations that are advocating for and working with young women and girls to really institute change and to see the world that we want to create for the better. So it's a scary time, but I believe the work that we're doing together as organizations by building these coalitions, by advocating with government, by putting in these budget recommendations, we are hopeful and we are working so that we are able to come out on the other side.
Yeah, and Emma, you and Anjum have both reinforced this idea, which I think many in our sector know, that long-term transformative systems level change does not happen with short-term approaches to funding. So whether it's the federal, provincial governments, municipal governments, private foundations, community foundations, individual donors, donor advised funds, whatever instrument and those who are managing them are, it's critically important that a longer term lens to sustainability is taken.
And if I may add, just building on the comments Emma made, it's something that not only impacts young people, but it's something that does have a detrimental impact on our country as a whole. So this was back in 2024, but a report by King's Trust Canada talked about the youth unemployment crisis could lead to an 18.5 billion reduction in GDP by 2034. So I can't even imagine what the numbers are looking like now, given the scale of impact in 2025. So something that, really highlights when we invest in one another, it helps the whole. And I think that's what we can do as the charitable sector, nonprofit sector.
Emma, I'm going to come to you for another question. Like many young people, they hesitate to step forward because they don't see themselves reflected or respected. So what advice would you give to girls or young people who want to lead, but feel like they're not being taken seriously?
That's a great question. And it really speaks to my heart because it speaks to my own journey in terms of how I have been able to navigate my career path. And the first thing I would say is that your journey doesn't have to be linear. My journey was definitely not linear. I wish I could say went to school, was successful, graduated, got the first job, and, it ushered me into leadership. But that wasn't the case. I had some road bumps along the way. And I had some lessons, but all of those lessons have led me to be the authentic leader that I pride myself to be in terms of what is true to me in terms of values in leadership. So the first thing I would tell any young person that is stepping into leadership or wants to lead is that your journey doesn't have to be linear. It is your own, and it makes you who you are as a leader. The second thing I would say is to find your network, find your community. You need your mentors, you need your peers, you need your allies, both personally and professionally. We cannot do this work alone. I stress that we cannot do this work alone. It's important to have a community around you to serve as a sounding board, to serve as guidance when or a troubleshooting, or just to serve as a safe space or a safer space when you're faced with significant challenges. It's so important. It's informed my journey, and still to this day, I have a network and a community that I can turn to for many things. So it's really important. And then I would say, just lead with purpose and integrity. Like, stay true to the values of who you are and what you believe. It's so important. It will guide your path in your career in whatever form of leadership you want to take. So stay true to yourself, and you will be ushered off course, where sometimes you'll have to make hard decisions about funding opportunities versus your values, and it's really about how do you reflect on what is true to you, and also speaks true to the mission and mandate that you're trying to lead with purpose on. So it's a multi-pronged approach, but ultimately, if you know who you are, I know it sounds very cliche, if you know who you are, it really is the first step in becoming the leader that you're meant to be.
Thank you. I think that is some great words of wisdom for those who are listening and thinking about their own journeys. So that kind of brings us to the end of our podcast. So we're going to close with the question that we ask every guest. And Anjum, we'll start with you. And specifically as it relates to International Day of the Girl, what gives you hope for the future as you're thinking about the future of girls and young women?
Thank you. I think about 15 years ago or so, when we even think about how International Day of the Girl was established, it's because of girls in Canada and girls around the world who came together to advocate for it. So Plan International Canada, along with many peers, we actually rallied thousands of girls and supporters in Canada and globally to push the Canadian government to establish the International Day of the Girl. And so it was interesting, when it was established, girls from Canada were there at the UN with our Minister on the Status of Women, Rona Ambrose. So it just shows that Canada has actually been part of the story around girls' rights globally. And when we think about this day, I think this is also a part of Canada's legacy on the global stage. What also gives me hope is, a refrain that we often say at Plan International Canada, which is young people are not just the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today, and really thinking about how do we unleash that leadership. So we talked a lot in this conversation about networks, skills, and platforms, and I think there's some actionable insights that we've shared around what folks can do. The other piece I'd like to say, and I've seen more people adopt this, which is really promising, is how do we move beyond mentorship to sponsorship? Because this is one of the things that I think there's opportunities to do more as a sector. So when I talk about sponsorship, I think about, us as leaders in the nonprofit and charitable sector. How are you pushing for high-profile stretch opportunities for your proteges? How are you building their visibility and their track record? Because often, if you want to move up in your career, that is very important. Some of those opportunities young women and just women in general don't have access to. It could look like amplifying the achievements of proteges, but also protecting them from backlash and really sharing your social capital. Each of us has social capital. We have our networks. How are each of us actually taking that social capital and giving it back to the next generation? And I think that's something all of us can do wherever we are in the sector.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Emma, same question to you. What gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope, as I always say, as an older millennial, what really truly gives me hope is the next generations. As I always say, they're so driven. They are so passionate. They lead with purpose. They lead with their values, and they're not afraid to back down. And that gives me hope that it's a generation that really, truly is about pushing for better, making this world better, making it more equitable, make it more accessible for those who have been marginalized in many different ways. And so that is the first thing that gives me hope. And the second thing that gives me hope is that in the face of adversity, and we see it now with the challenges we are having with the economy and employment and housing, how we are coming together at various ages, this intergenerational coalitions and communities and that are created to push for change, not only at the individual level through opportunities like crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, but also at the systems level by coming together to challenge and advocate for funding from government and to advocate for policy change. So ultimately, it really gives me hope that we're coming together to push for better. And it starts with our young people.
Absolutely. And as I wind up the podcast, and thank you both for taking the time, in your remarks, both of you referenced on numerous occasions the importance of mentorship, allyship, and it is clear that for girls and young women, there are two strong advocates in their corner because we just had the chance to speak with you both. So thank you for taking the time to join us here on Let's Imagine, and together we can celebrate International Day of the Girl. Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsor, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.